Ruth Johnson was 62 years old, and she lived on the same land where her great-grandmother had once stood, proud and unbroken. To outsiders, it was just an old patch of earth on the edge of town, but to Ruth, it was more than soil, more than trees, more than grass. It was memory. It was blood. It was history written in roots and stones. Her great-grandmother Clara had been born into chains, but had fought for freedom every single day of her life. After years of hard work, Clara saved enough pennies, nickels, and dimes to buy a piece of land when freedom finally came. It wasn't much, just a stretch of earth where wildflowers grew and oak trees stood tall, but it was hers. She had signed the deed with hands that still bore scars from years of toil. That deed had been passed down, generation after generation, until it finally came into Ruth's hands. Ruth kept the old papers tucked carefully in a drawer inside her kitchen. The pages were yellow and delicate, but they carried power. Every time she opened that drawer, she felt her grandmother's spirit whispering, "Don't let them take this from you. This land is our proof, our fight, our freedom." Ruth lived a quiet life on that land. She wasn't rich, but she was proud. Her small wooden house was modest but warm. Every morning she brewed tea, sat on her porch, and watched the sun rise over the trees. The neighbors rarely visited her, but that didn't matter. She had everything she needed: the peace of her land, the comfort of her memories, and the knowledge that her family's struggle had not been in vain. But the world outside didn't see Ruth the way she saw herself. To most people in town, she was just an old black woman living on forgotten land. Developers and businessmen drove past her house and didn't give it a second glance. Some people even wondered why she still held on to it. "She should sell," they whispered in grocery stores. "She's wasting that space." Yet Ruth never wavered. She knew what her land meant. It wasn't just property. It was the dream her great-grandmother had fought for. It was the foundation of her family's dignity. For many years, no one disturbed her. But one summer morning, Ruth noticed something unusual: the sound of trucks, heavy machinery growling in the distance. At first, she thought it was just road work or a new shop being built nearby. But the noise grew louder each day. Workers came with their orange vests and shiny helmets. Huge fences started rising, blocking her view of the horizon. Ruth sat on her porch, sipping her tea, and watched. The workers didn't glance her way. They didn't knock on her door. They just moved deeper and deeper, pouring cement, cutting trees, raising beams of wood. Weeks passed, and Ruth's peaceful mornings were no longer peaceful. Dust rose into the air. The sound of hammers and drills drowned out the birds. She finally walked to the edge of her land and stood there, staring at the commotion. That's when she saw something that made her heart drop. The new homes were not being built near her land. They were being built on her land. At first, she thought she might be mistaken. Maybe she was standing in the wrong spot. Maybe her memory of the boundary lines was blurred. But when she looked at the big fences and the heavy trucks rolling right through the part of the woods that her father had once cared for, she knew the truth. Ruth went home quietly that day. She opened the old drawer in her kitchen and unfolded the deed, running her fingers across the faded ink. Her great-grandmother's name was still there. Her family's history was still there. Her land was still there, written in black and white. The town may have forgotten her. The builders may have ignored her. But Ruth knew one thing: they had crossed a line, and they had no idea whose land they were standing on. Ruth did not sleep well that night. The sound of machines echoed in her ears, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw strangers walking on her land as if it belonged to them. She woke up before the sun, brewed her tea, and sat on her porch, but the peace that usually filled her heart was gone. Instead, she felt something heavy, something that told her life was about to change. By noon, more trucks arrived, big trucks carrying wood, cement, bricks, and tiles. Workers shouted to each other, lifting materials, driving into the very soil her family had worked so hard to protect. Ruth watched in silence, her heart pounding. She walked to the fence line again, her cane tapping the ground with every step. She wanted to see it with her own eyes, to be sure she wasn't imagining things. And there it was. New houses already standing where her family's orchard used to be. Her father had once planted peach trees there, years ago. Ruth could still remember the sweet smell of blossoms in spring, the way her mother used to bake peach pies in the summer. Now the orchard was gone, cut down without a thought. In its place, concrete foundations spread like a scar across the land. The sign on the fence read in bold letters, "Future Home of Oak Valley, a luxury HOA community." Ruth felt her chest tighten. Not only were they building, but they were building something big. 96 houses, they said, 96 new families. 96 homes on land that didn't belong to them. The people behind it were not small-town workers. They were developers, investors, and the head of a powerful homeowners association. The HOA was known for being ruthless, for pushing out anyone who stood in their way. They had money, lawyers, and influence. To them, Ruth was just a small obstacle they would sweep aside. But Ruth was not like the others. That evening, she walked back into her house and pulled out the drawer again. She unfolded the deed slowly, smoothing out the wrinkles. Her great-grandmother's signature was faded but still there, strong and proud. She remembered her grandmother's stories, how Clara had fought tooth and nail to buy that land when no one wanted a black woman to own anything. Every generation had carried that burden, keeping the land safe, paying the taxes, protecting it like a sacred treasure. Tears filled Ruth's eyes. How dare they think they could take it? How dare they think she would just roll over and let it? But when she looked outside again, she saw the truth. The workers weren't slowing down. The houses were going up fast. The HOA had poured money into this project, and they weren't planning to stop. Ruth didn't march to the fence. She didn't scream at the workers. She didn't call the police because deep down she knew the police wouldn't listen. She was just an old woman to them, living on land that now looked like a construction site. Instead, she sat at her table, lit a small lamp, and began organizing her papers. She pulled out property maps, tax receipts, and letters her father had written long ago. Each paper told the same truth. This land was hers. For the next few days, Ruth stayed quiet. The town whispered just as they always had. She can't stop them, some said. That HOA is too powerful. They'll pay her a little money, and she'll have to move. Others laughed, calling her stubborn, saying she was clinging to a past that didn't matter anymore. But Ruth didn't answer. She let them talk. She let the HOA keep building, keep spending, keep putting all their resources into homes that didn't belong to them, because Ruth knew something they didn't know. Every brick they laid, every nail they hammered, every wall they raised, it was all on land that was legally hers. They weren't just stealing. They were digging themselves into a trap, and Ruth was patient enough to let them walk right into it. Days turned into weeks, and the houses rose faster than weeds after rain. Where there had once been wild grass and peach trees, now stood neat rows of freshly painted homes, each with wide driveways and bright windows. Trucks came in and out every day delivering more supplies. The sound of saws, hammers, and engines filled the air until Ruth could barely hear the birds anymore. The whole town seemed to know what was happening. People whispered about it in stores, in churches, and at barber shops. They shook their heads, but most of them thought Ruth was powerless. "She can't do anything," one woman said in the grocery aisle. "The HOA has lawyers. They'll crush her." "She's just one old lady," another man muttered. "She should take whatever money they offer and leave." Ruth heard those whispers, but she didn't answer. She walked slowly through the aisles, her head held high, and when people looked at her with pity or mockery, she gave them the same steady gaze she gave the sunrise every morning. Quiet. Patient. Certain. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch, sipping tea, a shiny black car pulled up to her driveway. Out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, his shoes polished so bright they caught the sun. He walked with confidence, the kind of confidence of someone who had never been told no in his life. Behind him, two other men followed, both carrying thick folders. The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp like a blade. "Ms. Johnson," he said smoothly, "I'm Mr. Harris, president of the Oak Valley Homeowners Association. I'm sure you've noticed the progress we've made next door. Beautiful homes, don't you think? A wonderful addition to the community." Ruth didn't move. She didn't smile back. She only raised her teacup slowly and took a sip. Harris continued, his voice oily with confidence. "Now, there's a small issue. According to our plans, your house sits right where we intend to finish our main entrance. I understand you believe the land is yours, but I assure you, everything has been handled properly. What I suggest, Ms. Johnson, is that you accept our offer. We're prepared to be generous. We'll pay you well, and you can relocate. It will be easier for everyone." The men behind him opened their folders, sliding papers across her porch table as though they were doing her a favor. Ruth set her teacup down and looked at the papers. She didn't touch them. She didn't sign them. She didn't even glance at the numbers printed in bold. Instead, she lifted her eyes slowly to Harris. Her voice when she spoke was calm, soft, but firm. "This land is mine." For the first time, Harris's smile faltered. He leaned forward. "Ms. Johnson, I don't think you understand. These houses are already built. 96 families are waiting to move in. You won't win. You're better off taking the money now before it gets difficult." Ruth leaned back in her chair. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, her gaze steady. She said nothing more. The silence stretched long and heavy. Harris shifted, clearly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people refusing him, especially not without shouting or begging. He snapped his fingers and his men gathered the papers quickly. "We'll be in touch," he muttered before turning on his heel. The car door slammed, and the black car rolled away, kicking up dust on the gravel road. Ruth sat there long after they left. She felt no fear, no panic. Instead, she felt the strength of her ancestors rising in her chest. She thought of her great-grandmother Clara, who had signed that deed with shaking hands, but a proud heart. She thought of her father, who had protected every fence post as if it were gold. Ruth would do the same. Let them build. Let them spend their millions. Let them think she was silent because she was weak. They didn't know that her silence was her weapon, and soon they would find out exactly what it meant. The days after Mr. Harris's visit grew heavier. The black car returned often, sometimes with lawyers in fine suits, other times with envelopes stuffed with documents. Each visit was the same. They spoke with authority, with polished words that sounded more like threats than offers. "Ms. Johnson, this is your last chance," one lawyer warned. "If you don't agree, you'll be facing serious legal consequences. You'll lose everything." Ruth never raised her voice. She never argued. She simply looked them in the eye, listened quietly, and then said the same words each time. "This land is mine." Her calmness rattled them more than anger would have. They left her porch in frustration, slamming their folders shut, muttering to each other about how stubborn she was. Soon, the letters began arriving, thick white envelopes, with the HOA seal stamped on them. They came almost every day, some by mail, others hand-delivered. Inside were words written to frighten her. Eviction notice, illegal occupancy, final warning. But Ruth was not afraid. She would sit at her wooden kitchen table, open each letter, and read it carefully. Then she would place it neatly into a growing stack of papers on the corner of the table. She didn't tear them up. She didn't throw them away. She kept everything, just as her father had once told her to do. "Paper speaks," he used to say. "If you want justice, keep the paper. One day it will speak for you." Ruth believed him. Meanwhile, the houses on her land continued to rise. Bright roofs were nailed into place. White fences went up. Driveways were paved. Families drove by, slowly in their cars, pointing at the new homes with excitement, dreaming of the day they would move in. None of them knew the truth, that their dream homes were sitting on stolen land. Neighbors began to whisper louder now. Some shook their heads pitying Ruth, others mocked her. "She's going to lose everything," one man said at the diner. She should have taken the money when she had the chance, another added. She's too old to fight them, a woman muttered. Ruth heard their words, but she didn't let them sink into her heart. She knew what they didn't. She knew she had the deed, the tax receipts, the maps. She knew she had truth on her side. One evening, after the sun had dipped low and the sound of construction had finally gone quiet, Ruth sat by her lamp and spread the papers across the table. The deed from her great-grandmother, the old property, maps her father had drawn on, the tax receipts she had paid year after year without fail. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched them, not from fear, but from the weight of history. Every paper was proof that her family's blood, sweat, and sacrifice had not been for nothing. She whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "Clara, I will not let them take this from us." The next morning, a court summons arrived. The HOA was officially taking her to trial. They claimed she was illegally occupying land that belonged to Oak Valley. They were confident, bold, certain they would crush her in front of a judge. Ruth read the summons slowly, then folded it neatly and placed it on top of the stack of papers. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply nodded as if this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. The storm had finally broken. The fight was no longer whispers, no longer threats. It was official. It was real. And Ruth was ready. For weeks she gathered everything she needed. She visited the county clerk's office, pulling old records no one else remembered. She spoke softly with the few neighbors who still respected her, asking if they'd be willing to stand as witnesses. Each day she grew stronger, her determination sharpening like steel. The HOA thought they had cornered her. They thought the courtroom would be the place she finally gave up. But Ruth smiled to herself as she packed her papers into a neat leather folder. They had no idea the trap they were walking into. The day of the trial came heavy with clouds. Ruth woke early, her body moving slower than it once had, but her spirit steady as ever. She dressed in her best Sunday outfit, a soft blue dress that had belonged to her mother and a wide-brimmed hat she only wore on important days. Today was important. Today she would not just stand for herself, but for every generation before her. She clutched her worn leather folder close as she entered the courthouse. The tall building with its white pillars seemed to stare down at her, but Ruth lifted her chin high. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she made her way to the courtroom. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. The HOA had arrived in full force. Mr. Harris sat at the front, his expensive suit crisp, his smile smug. Around him were sharp-looking lawyers with stacks of thick binders and polished briefcases. Behind them, a few curious townspeople filled the benches, whispering as Ruth quietly took her seat at the other table. To them, the sight was almost laughable, one old woman with a single folder against an army of attorneys. The judge entered, and the room rose. The trial began. The HOA lawyers wasted no time. They stood tall, speaking with confidence, presenting maps and documents they claimed proved Oak Valley's ownership. They painted Ruth as confused, as someone who had misunderstood property lines, as an elderly woman clinging to land that didn't belong to her anymore. Their voices rang with authority, echoing through the courtroom like thunder. Mr. Harris even leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking. He believed it was already over. When it was Ruth's turn, the judge looked at her kindly, perhaps with a touch of pity. "Ms. Johnson," he said gently, "you may present your case." Ruth rose slowly, the weight of her years heavy in her bones, but the weight of her ancestors strong in her heart. She carried her folder to the stand, placed it down, and opened it carefully. Her hands, though wrinkled, were steady. She began with the deed, a faded piece of paper, yellow with age, edges worn soft by time. She handed it to the judge. "This," she said in her calm, steady voice, "was signed by my great-grandmother, Clara Johnson, in the year 1872. She bought this land with her own money, and it has stayed in my family ever since." The courtroom fell silent. She went on, pulling out tax receipts, each stamped and dated, showing that her family had paid faithfully for generations. She showed property maps, old and new, all marking the same lines. Every year, Ruth said softly, we paid to keep this land. My father kept it, I kept it. We never sold it, we never gave it away. It has always been ours. The judge examined the documents, his expression shifting from polite patience to quiet seriousness. The lawyers for the HOA flipped through their binders frantically, whispering to one another, their confidence slipping. Mr. Harris's smirk disappeared. His face grew pale. Ruth continued, her voice firm now, strong with the weight of history. This land was bought with the sweat of my grandmother's back. It was protected by my father's hands, and now it is mine. You built your homes here, but you built them on land that does not belong to you. Her words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The judge cleared his throat, his tone heavy with authority. The evidence is clear. This land belongs to Ms. Johnson. All construction has occurred unlawfully. The HOA has no legal claim. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some of the townspeople leaned forward in shock, others in awe. The lawyers sat frozen, their mouths slightly open. Mr. Harris gripped the edge of the table, his jaw tight, his confidence shattered. Ruth, however, did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply nodded, her eyes closing for a brief moment as tears threatened to fall. She whispered silently to herself, "We did it, Clara. We did it." The courtroom had seen many battles, but that day, it witnessed something more. A victory not just for Ruth, but for the generations who had fought silently so she could stand there. The HOA had built 96 homes, but with just one deed, one voice, and one woman's courage, the trap had finally sprung. The courthouse steps felt taller that day as Ruth slowly made her way down, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. The trial was over. The judge's words still echoed in her ears. "This land belongs to Ms. Johnson." Around her, people whispered. Some were shocked, some were angry, and some, though they would never admit it aloud, were secretly proud of what she had done. But Ruth didn't pay attention to the voices. She clutched her folder close to her chest, walked down those steps, and breathed deeply as if she were breathing for all the women before her. When she reached her porch later that evening, she sat in her old rocking chair, the one her father had built with his own hands. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and the sound of cicadas filled the warm summer air. For the first time in weeks, the construction noises were gone. No hammers, no trucks, just silence. Ruth closed her eyes, and memories washed over her like waves. She saw her great-grandmother Clara, bent over the earth, digging with tired hands to plant seeds. She saw her father patching fences in the hot sun, his shirt soaked with sweat. She saw her mother in the kitchen, baking peach pies from the orchard that once bloomed where houses now stood. Every image came alive, reminding her of the sacrifices that had been made so that she could sit here now. Each generation had carried the burden of protecting this land, and now, Ruth had carried it too. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from pride. They had tried to erase her. They had tried to take what was not theirs, but they had failed. That night, Ruth lit a candle on her kitchen table. She placed the deed next to it, the old paper glowing softly in the flickering light. She whispered, aloud as if her ancestors were sitting right there with her, "I kept it safe. I didn't let them take it. This land is still ours." The candle flame wavered, and for a moment Ruth felt a deep peace in her chest, as though Clara herself had reached across time and touched her shoulder in thanks. But victory did not erase the weight of what had happened. 96 homes had been built on her land. Families were waiting to move in, their dreams tied up in houses that stood on stolen soil. The HOA was scrambling, the lawyers were planning their next move, and the town was buzzing with gossip. Ruth knew the battle wasn't completely over. There would be more negotiations, more lawyers, more arguments about what came next. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had already faced the storm, and she had won. The next day, news reporters arrived, their cameras flashing, their microphones eager. They asked her how she felt, what she planned to do with the land, what it meant to win against such powerful people. Ruth didn't give them long speeches. She didn't pose proudly for their pictures. She simply said, "This land has been in my family for over 100 years. It will stay in my family, that's all." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of history. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks. But Ruth knew they could never truly capture what it felt like to fight for something bigger than yourself, something planted deep in the roots of your soul. That night she sat on her porch again, looking at the sky full of stars. She thought of her grandchildren and their children to come. They would never have to fight the same fight. They would never have to wonder if the land would be stolen, because Ruth had stood her ground. And in that quiet moment, with the night breeze brushing against her face, Ruth knew the truth. This victory was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were too small, too powerless, too invisible to matter. She had proved them all wrong. The weeks after the court ruling felt like a strange dream. Construction at Oak Valley stopped overnight. The workers, once so loud and certain, packed up their tools and drove away. The fences stood unfinished, the paint on the half-built homes already starting to fade under the summer sun. The HOA had poured millions into this project, and now it all sat on land they didn't own. Every house, every streetlight, every driveway, they all belonged to Ruth. At first, the HOA tried to fight back. They filed appeals, sent more letters, even tried to intimidate her with new lawyers. But the truth was too strong. The deed, the receipts, the maps, all of it stood like a wall they could not climb. Every courtroom they entered, every judge they faced, the answer was the same. The land belongs to Ms. Johnson. Finally, the HOA realized they were cornered. They had only two choices: either tear down 96 homes brick by brick, or pay Ruth for every inch of land they had stolen. And so, with their pride swallowed and their pockets bleeding, they chose to pay. The number was more than Ruth had ever imagined. Enough to secure her family's future for generations. Enough to turn the whispers of pity in town into gasps of awe. Reporters called it the HOA's billion-dollar mistake. Neighbors who once doubted her now stopped by with wide eyes and careful words. But Ruth didn't celebrate with noise or pride. She didn't throw parties or wave checks in the air. She used the money to restore her family's land, to rebuild the fences, to protect what her ancestors had fought so hard to keep. On quiet evenings, she would sit on her porch, rocking slowly, watching the sun dip low behind the rows of houses that once mocked her. Now they stood as monuments to her patience, her silence, her strength. They thought they were building homes. She whispered to herself one evening, but they were building my proof. The trap had been simple, yet powerful. Ruth hadn't fought with anger. She hadn't screamed or cursed. She had waited. She had let them build, let them spend, let them believe they had won. And when the time was right, she opened her folder and showed the truth. It was never about revenge. It was about respect for her grandmother, for her father, for every hand that had worked this land before her. One Sunday, her granddaughter, little Naomi, climbed onto her lap. The child's curious eyes looked out at the fields. "Grandma?" she asked softly. "Is all this ours?" Ruth kissed the top of her head and smiled. "Yes, baby. And don't you ever forget it. This land is our story, and no one can take it from us." Naomi nodded, her small hands clutching Ruth's dress. She didn't understand the weight of those words yet, but one day she would. One day she would know that her grandmother had stood, alone against a powerful army, and won. As the years went by, Oak Valley became more than just a neighborhood. It became a reminder. People spoke of it as a cautionary tale, a story of arrogance meeting justice. And at the center of it all was Ruth Johnson, the quiet woman who had held on to her family's land with the strength of 100 years of history. She never called herself a hero. She never asked for thanks. She simply lived, breathed, and guarded the soil beneath her feet just as Clara had once done, because Ruth knew the truth. The HOA had built 96 homes on stolen land. They thought she was powerless. They thought she was invisible. But they had walked straight into her trap, and Ruth had won.